Welcome back. So in this particular video, we are going to take a step further in building this application. So here is what we are going to cover. So first thing, we are going to set up the required services. So everything that we need, all the services that we need, we are going to set it up, and we are going to set the view in IntelliJ as well. We are going to set up the database connections. For example, one of the services is going to make use of a relational database. Other service is going to make use of MongoDB. So we are going to set up those database connection. Now, in the process of setting up database connections, you will understand how you can get different kinds of services to work with different databases. So that's a different experience that you will get if you're following along. Then we will start building the endpoints, and to begin with, we will pick up the endpoint for the activity service. So that is what we are going to pick up first. And we'll define all the endpoints because these endpoints are going to help us save the data, retrieve the data, and do all of that. Okay, so get ready for this, and yes, do watch the video till the very end. And also, I will mention I have the entire playlist link in the description section of this playlist. Has the entire course. So if you're willing to follow the entire course over here, because this video is a part of an entire course series for Full-Stack Microservices project. So if you're new to this particular series, feel free to head over to the description section to get the link to the playlist, because that will help you follow from the start. Okay. Also, if by any chance you have not liked, subscribed to this particular channel, be sure to do so. I keep bringing in such amazing free content. And without further ado, let's jump right in. So now it's time that we begin setting up the user microservice, and I'm here onto our favorite website, which is Spring Initializer. And here what we are going to do is we are going to select the desired configuration. So I'm going to say Maven. Over here, you can choose Gradle if you wish to. Language is Java. I'll select a version of Spring Boot that I want to use. Now you'll see some different version depending on when you're watching this video, but don't worry, things should work absolutely fine because every now and then there are new versions being released. And I'm going to call this as, so I'll have a group called com.fitness. Artifact is user service, something like this. And you'll see this package name being auto-generated. So com.fitness.userservice. I'm happy with this package name. I'll make sure that I select jar over here and jar version to that of 23. You can select the right jar version for yourself. I'll add the dependencies. Now, in case of dependencies, I will first add dependency called as web, because it's a web project and we are going to have APIs over here. So web is important. I'll add one more. I'll say Lombok over here. Now, why Lombok? Because Lombok helps us reduce boilerplate code by so we can generate getters, setters just with the help of annotation. So that these two things I'm going to add, and I am also going to add a dependency for either for the database. So you can either add MySQL or PostgreSQL. So I've chosen PostgreSQL over here. So I'll just select PostgreSQL over here. Okay. So yeah, this is what we need, and I believe we are all set to go ahead. Okay. I'll also add one more called as validation over here. This is just for validating things in our application. Okay. Now what we are going to do is, with the help of Spring Initializer, this is going to help us generate a Spring Boot project. Okay. Now if you have a pro version or paid version of IntelliJ IDEA Ultimate, because ultimately we are going to import this project into IntelliJ. So if you have IntelliJ IDEA Ultimate, you don't need to make use of Spring Initializer, because with IntelliJ IDEA Ultimate, you can directly create project inside the pro version or inside the IDE. Okay. So you can click explore to see the project structure that it's going to generate for you. All right. If you're happy with everything, you can see like there's a pom.xml because we have chosen Maven. You can simply say generate, and this is going to give you a zip file. Now download this zip file and save it into your project workspace. So I would recommend you create a folder on your local machine and create all the projects over there. Okay, so that everything is organized. So what I've done is I've downloaded the zip file that was generated through Spring Initializer, and I've downloaded into a folder wherein I'll be having all my project related files. And you can see this is the folder that I've created called Fitness Microservice. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just unzip it over here. You can make use of any extractor software that helps you extract zip files. Okay. And you'll have this extracted. Okay. Now you don't need this zip file. So I'm just going to simply delete this. Okay. You can delete it if you wish to. So I'll just delete it. Now, after this is deleted, what you need to do is we need to head over to IntelliJ and import this project into our IDE. Now, what I've done is I've opened IntelliJ and here we are going to open our project. Okay, so I'm going to say open over here. Okay, this is a welcome screen. I'm seeing all the past projects here on the right hand side. You probably might not see this if you're new to IntelliJ. So just say open over here. And just navigate quickly to the directory where you have extracted the user service. So this is a directory where you have extracted user service, right? Now above this directory, there is Fitness Microservice. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to select this project, but instead I'm going to open the parent project. Okay. So I'll open this parent project and I'll expand this. Okay. Now, why have I opened this parent project? Because I'm going to have many more microservices inside this parent folder. So I don't want to I don't want to open a new window of IntelliJ for every project that I create. Okay, so I've opened this over here and you can see user service over here. Okay, up here. And also, if you see this, it does not have an icon of Maven on this user service because it's not loaded right now as a Maven project. And here you can see this suggestion from IntelliJ that Maven build script found. Load this particular project as a Maven project. Okay, so you can simply say load over here. Okay, and what it's going to do is it is going to load the entire project as a Maven project. And you can see over here the Maven icon, like the square icon, rectangle square of blue color, has appeared now on user service because it is now being identified as a Maven project. And the moment you load this user service, you are going to see some sort of processing like you saw at the bottom, wherein all the dependencies were downloaded. Okay, and you're seeing a Maven icon over here as well. Now I'll tell you something. There might be times wherein Maven might not recognize this as or IntelliJ might not recognize this as a Maven project. Okay, so here if you observe, I saw a pop-up at the bottom like load or Maven project identified. So load the Maven scripts, and the project was automatically identified by IntelliJ as a Maven project. Okay. And that is why I'm seeing this icon over here. And, if you come inside over here, okay, into this Java file, you're seeing like it is identifying all of this. Like this is a annotation and all of this. It's also identifying the syntax over here. Why? Because this is loaded as a Maven project. So IntelliJ identifies this. But if for some reason you don't see that pop up, then what you can do is you can go to File, New, and you can select module from existing sources over here. Okay, and when you select this, just head over or scroll over to user service and select pom.xml over here. Okay, and what this will do is this will bring in, or this will import this, or this is telling IntelliJ that hey, this is a Maven project and you need to reload this project as a Maven project, or you need to identify this project as a Maven project. So you can see over here, select IntelliJ IDEA module directory with existing sources. So you can, for Eclipse, this is what you need to select. For Eclipse project, for Maven project, you need to select this. For Gradle build, you need to select this. Okay, so if you have chosen Gradle by chance when creating the project, you can select Gradle over here. But I've selected POM like Maven, so I'll be selecting pom.xml. Okay, and once you do OK, you will see it being identified as the Maven project, and you will also see this Maven icon over here. Okay. Now we are in Fitness Microservice folder, and within that I have user service, right? Now all the other microservices will come in this Fitness Microservice folder. Okay. And you will have a complete picture of all the microservices in this single window. All right. And yeah, that's the setup we needed for user service. And I hope you have been able to follow along. So now it's time that we begin setting up our models into the application. So I'll quickly head over to the main package over here, which is com.fitness.userservice. And over here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new file. So I'm going to say new Java class, and I'm going to call this class as user, and I'll have this class inside a package called model. Okay, so you can see there is a sub package being created, com fitness user service dot model. Within this, I have user class over here. Now we'll annotate over here. We'll call this as entity. Okay, so entity is not coming in because we have not added the dependency for JPA. All right, so what I'll quickly do is I'll switch over to Spring Initializer. And over here, I'm going to say add dependency JPA, Spring Data JPA. Okay, and I'll say explore, and I'll scroll down over here. Okay, and here you will see this dependency being added into the pom.xml. So just copy this and paste it in pom.xml. So here, come over to pom.xml. Okay, where is pom.xml? Here. And you can paste it within dependencies. Okay, so I'm quickly going to do that, and you'll get this reload Maven changes. So just reload this Maven changes. Okay, and you'll see the dependencies would be added. And now if you try to make use of entity, okay, you should see Jakarta persistence being added. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to say table. You can add this annotation if you want a custom name for your table. So I'll call this table as users table. Okay, so that there is no conflict with the internal user table if there is any inside the database. And I'll mark this as data. This is a annotation that I'm getting from Lombok, which will help me generate the getters and setters. So you can see it will help us generate getters, setters, required argument constructor, toString, and equals and hash code. If you hover on this, that is what the documentation you see. Okay, now over here it's time that we define certain fields. So I'm going to say private string ID, ID and semicolon. I'll say private string email. So whatever you want to store from a user standpoint, I'm going to quickly add that. We'll have a password as well over here. I'll say first name, last name. So I'll simply copy this. Okay, because this is common. I'll say first name. Okay, something like this, and I'll have last name up here, and then we will need user role, right? So I'll say private user role. Now user role does not exist yet, but we'll be creating user role dot user. Okay, so this is something I need to define. I'm seeing red mark. That is absolutely fine. Okay, I'll say private local date and time, and I'll say created at. Okay, and then I'll have private local date time, and I'll say updated at. Okay, so we are storing the created at and updated at dates. Okay, and I think we are good. All right, now what we will do is we'll create this user role. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'll hover on this, and are we getting? Okay, so you can see this is an enum over here. Okay, so I want to have a enum called user role, which will store the roles that we have in our application or that we want to define in our application. So I'll just create this enum, and I'll create this under model itself. Okay, and I'll say okay, and you can see this is created. So I'll say user comma admin over here. So these are the two roles that exist in our application, and you can see the error disappeared. Okay, now we'll quickly annotate this. Okay, so this will be ID over here. Okay, this is ID. And ID because this is the unique identifier for every user that we have. And I'll have this auto generated. I'll say generated value, and strategy is generation type. You can have UUID. Okay, UID. Okay, this is done, and I have annotation over here. So I'll say column. Okay, this is coming in from Jakarta persistence again. I'll say unique is equal to true. So email, I want all the emails to be unique. Nullable is false. Okay, then we have passwords, wherein I'm going to say column, and I'm going to say nullable is equal to false. Oops, not name. You can say nullable is equal to false. Okay, first name, last name is absolutely okay. And for this, if you're making use of enum, you have to say enumerated, something like this, and I'll say enum type string. Okay, this is done. And then I have created at and updated at. So what I will do is I'll say created, and you can see created creation timestamp. Okay, so creation timestamp. This is the annotation that you want to get. Now, what is creation timestamp? If you hover on this, okay, you will be taken to its class, and there's no documentation here, so I'll just say download sources. Okay, and you'll see over here, okay, specifies that the annotated field of the property is generated creation timestamp. Okay, so timestamp is generated just once when an entity instance is inserted into a database. Okay, so this is important. So what this means is whenever any entity is inserted into this table, this field is automatically populated. You don't need to populate it. That is what it means. Okay, you can see over here. By default, the generated timestamp is generated by memory, but this may change explicitly by specifying the source. So you can specify source as well. Okay, so this is done, and we have this creation timestamp. Now I'll have update timestamp as well. Update timestamp here. This is another annotation which you can see specifies that the annotated field of the property is generated update timestamp, and the timestamp is regenerated every time when an entity instance is updated in the database. So you don't need to populate this field. It will be auto populated by JPA. Okay, or Hibernate is what I should say. So if you hover on this is coming in from Hibernate. These are Hibernate based annotations. Okay, so you can imagine the power of Spring Boot here. Okay, because if you are updating it manually, it's an additional task for you. You have just added a couple of annotations and things are done. Things are taken care of. Right, so this is done. Now what we will do is after this entity is set, we now need to connect into the database. Now, in order to get this entity populated, what I'll do is I'll switch over to PostgreSQL, and here is where I have this PG admin installed. Okay, so be sure to have this over here, and I have this connection also created. Okay, so I'll create a database over here. You can create a database. I'll call this database as fitness user DB, something like this. Okay, and just save it. Okay, this is saved. Now what I will do is, so if you come over here right now, here you would see there are under schema public, there are no tables right now. There are no tables. Okay, so I'll come over here and I'll first have a connection being created to the database. So you can either make use of application.properties file, or you can rename this. I've seen quite a few people or quite a few students requesting me for YAML configuration. So here I'm making use of YAML. Okay, you can just rename this to YAML, and you can say Spring. Okay, so I'll first get rid of this. Okay, Spring. Okay, application, and I will say name over here. Okay, and this is how the user service will be. Okay, and then what you can do is you can specify the data source. Okay, now how do you do that? So what you are going to do is you're going to say data source over here, and I'm going to say URL user name over here. Okay, so I'm going to specify URL username, and I'm going to say password, something like this. Okay, so here I'm going to say JDBC. Okay, and since our database is PostgreSQL, I'll specify PostgreSQL. If you're making use of MySQL, specify MySQL over here. I'm going to say localhost : 5432, because this is the port that the database is running on my machine. And I'll say fitness user DB. Okay, something like this. Enter your username and password. So username for my system or my local database password is Postgres, and here admin @123, something like this. Okay, so this is done. And now what you can do is you can also specify Spring JPA, and I'll say Hibernate, and you can say DTL -auto, and you can say update over here. Okay, this is one. And another thing you can specify is you can say database platform, and you can say org.hibernate, and you can specify the dialect.PostgreSQL dialect. Okay, So, okay, there are a few typos, hyphenate, and you can say post gray SQL dialect. So this is fine, okay, and this is a database platform that we have specified. Okay, this is done, and here you can see this is duplicate, so this key has to be only once. So what I will do is I'll get rid of this and I'll take this up, above. Okay, so there's a typo here as well, hibernate. This can be hibernate. Okay, I'll save this, and what I will do is let us run the application and let us see if we are able to get the user service table. Okay, so I'm getting this pop-up, enable annotation processing. I'll say enable. Okay, and let us see. So the application is running, there are no issues or errors. And now if I come here to table, you'll see users table being created. So we have successfully established the table over here, or sorry, established the connection over here, and the table is created. So you can see over here, here if you scroll up, you should see some sort of logs which tell you, you can see, of relation users does not exist. So there are no relations. So that is what it's saying. Okay, it's talking about database something over here. So which means it was able to establish the connection with PostgreSQL, and we are now able to get this user entity populated into the database. Okay, so I hope you have been able to follow so far. It's pretty straightforward. You can make use of the application properties as well for this kind of connection. You can make use of PostgreSQL as well. Okay, so yeah, this is done, and I'll just close this main application file. So now it's time that we begin setting up the controller that will help us expose certain endpoints to our end users. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and I'm going to say new Java class, and I'm going to say controller. So I'm going to create a sub package called controller, and under this I'm going to name a controller. I'm going to say user controller. You can call this auth controller as well. Okay, but this is a user controller. And within this user controller, I am going to have a few endpoints definition. Okay, so first I'm going to say, so let me not start defining the method. So I'll just define get mapping over here. And this first one is to get the user profile. So I can say I'll accept user ID as the path parameter. Okay, and here at the top, I'll mark this as REST controller first of all, and I'll also add request mapping, so that this entire controller is mapped to this endpoint. Okay, something like this. So user ID over here. Okay, and I'm going to say public response entity. Okay, response entity, something like this, and this is going to return something, and I'm going to say get user profile. Okay, and this is going to return something. Okay, so I'm going to return null for now, or return empty something. Okay, so this is what we are creating. I'll have some parameters defined here, but in a while. Okay, let me define the endpoints that we want to have. So first thing is this, wherein I'm getting the user profile, and the next endpoint that I'm going to need is to create the user profile, right? So I'm going to say register. We can call it register or create or whatever you want to, and this can be register, something like this. And I'll have a empty string return over here, something like this. Okay, now let us go concrete in this. So here, what are we going to return? We are going to return user response, something like this. So this is a DTO that I'm going to create, which is a data transfer object, which is going to represent the response. Okay, so this is what I'm doing, and get user profile is going to accept the path variable. So this is a path variable which is coming in, which is user ID. And I'm going to say string user ID, something like this. Okay, and here I'm going to say response entity. So response entity dot OK, and inside body I'm going to say user service. So we are going to have a service as well defined, which does not exist, and it is going to have this get user profile user ID function. Okay, so these two things do not exist. We'll be defining them shortly. Don't worry about this. Okay, so here now in register, what are we going to do? In register also, we are going to have a user response, something like this. Okay, and this will be register. And inside register, what you can do is you can accept a request, like the request in a certain format. Okay, so I can say the request body can be of register request type. Okay, register request type. Now register request does not exist, so we'll have to create a DTO again for that. Okay, and here also I'm going to return something similar, so I'll just copy this entire thing and I'll paste it over here, and this will be request dot, and I'll have a method inside this. I'll call this as register, something like this. Okay, and this will be instead of user ID, this will go in request. Okay, so yeah, these are our controllers. Now we need to start defining these, like user response and user service. So what I will do is I'll first create user response. So create a parameter of type user response. I'll go to more actions and I'll say create a class. We don't want a parameter, but it should be a class, and the class will be not in controller, but I'll have a separate package called DTO because this is a DTO object, and I'll say okay. All right, so this is created now. Now here what we are going to do is here we need to define what all fields we want to be part, like we want this particular class to be part. Okay, so how will you decide that? So whatever response should be seen by the user is what goes over here. Okay, and we have this user entity. So out of this, what all you want to display? Okay, so what I will do is I'll copy like everything from here, like everything, come over here in user response and just paste this over here. Okay, so I'll get rid of these annotations. These annotations are not needed. This role also I'll get rid of. Okay, we don't need to showcase role, and yeah, something like this. Okay, this is done. I'll just get rid of these Hibernate related imports. Okay, so this is done, and I'll just have one annotation, which is the data annotation for generating the getters and setters here. Okay, now come over here. This is user response. This is defined. We also need user service. Okay, so what I will do is I will create a service class. So I'll say new. I'll come over here. I'll say service package, and I'll say user service, something like this. So this is a new class that exists now, and I'll immediately annotate it with service annotation over here. And here what I'm going to do is I'm going to say private user service, and I'm going to say user service, something like this. Okay, so this is done, and I will say auto wire over here. So either you say auto wire over here, or you can actually add an all args constructor as well, all args constructor. Okay, so if a constructor is being added over here with the help of Lombok, this will be automatically wired. All right, so that is what I've done. Or you can make use of auto wired annotation as well. Right, so this is done. User service, we now have requests, we now have access to user service, but user service does not have these two methods. We'll be defining them shortly. We also need to define register request. So I'll say more actions, create a class called register request, and I'll say DTO is the package where I want to create this, because this is a data transfer object, right? So I'll say okay, and you can see register request is now being created. Right, now what I will do is we need to like define over here as to what all we want to accept from the user as a part of the request. Okay, so for registering the user, I'll say I need email. Okay, I need a password over here, something like this. I need string first name. Okay, and I need last name, something like this. Okay, so these four things is what I am going to need. I'm going to add data annotation over here, which is for Lombok. All right, so this is something that I've done over here. Okay, now what I will do is so this is done. Okay, we have this register request. I can even add some sort of validations over here, since we have the validation dependency also being added in pom.xml. So if you go to pom.xml here, okay, we have this validation being added, right? This being added. So you can add a few validations if you want to. So here I've added @valid, and here in register request, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say not blank over here, and I can pass in a message. I can say email is required. So this is a message just in case this validation fails. I'm also going to say email validation over here, and this is going to say message. Okay, message. What will be the message? Invalid email format, something like this. Okay, For password, I'm going to say not blank. So password cannot be blank, and I'll say message password is required, something like this. Okay. And then I'll say size over here. What should be the password size? So I'll say minimum of 6, and if it's not minimum of 6, then I can say message. And here I'll say password must be at least of 6 characters. Okay, 6 characters. Password must have at least. So I've changed the message. Password must have at least 6 characters. Okay. So yeah, this is done for passwords. For first name, last name, I'll leave them as is. So you can make use of validations this way. You can validate it. We have added valid annotation as well. So this will be validated when the request hits this controller. Okay. This is done. Now these two methods do not exist, right? So what we will do is we'll define these two methods one by one. So I'll create this get user profile first over here, or let's create register first. So first we'll be registering the user, right? So I said create, and this is now, okay, so this got created in register request. Okay, so 1 second. If you come over here, okay, so this is request. This should not be request, but this should be user service. Okay, so this will be this method will be in user service and not in register request. So I'll hover on this. I'll say create this method, and this method is now created. Okay, so this is a method wherein we will be registering the user into our application. So what are we going to do first? Okay, so first thing, we are going to say user. We're going to create the user object. Now this user is our user model. Okay, I'm going to say new. Oops, so it will be is equal to new user over here, something like this. And I'm going to say user dot set email over here, and I'll say request dot get email. Okay, and we get password as well, right? So I'm going to say user dot get or user dot set password. Okay, set password, and I'm going to say request dot get password, something like this. So we are setting the password. I'm going to say user dot set first name, and I'm going to say request dot get first name, and here we need to set the last name as well. Okay, set last name. Okay, so I'm going to say request dot get last name. So this is done. Okay, and what we are going to do is we need to now save this user into the database, right? So how do you save this user into the database? We need to have a repository layer for that. So I'm going to say new Java class, and I'm going to say repository dot I'm going to say user repository, something like this. Okay, and this will be created. So actually this should not be a class, but this should be an interface. Okay, and this interface will be extending JPA repository. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll say extends JPA repository over here, and we'll have to specify the repository. This is the repository, and we'll have to specify string over here. Okay, so this is done over here, and I'll mark this as repository. Okay, like so. Okay, so now if you come to user service, okay, we need to get an instance of this repository first of all. So I'll say private user repository, something like this, and I'm going to say repository over here, and I'm going to call AutoWire over here. Okay, AutoWire, something like this. And now over here, I'm going to say user repository. Okay, so repository dot save, and we'll save user over here. This is what we are going to do. Okay, so this is done. Now if you go to user over here, we have ID that is auto generated, email, password, first name, last name are coming in from the request, right? This is auto generated. This is predefined, and these two are also predefined. These two are also auto generated. Okay, in a way. So we have all the fields that we need for the user to get created. Okay, so this is taken care of, and user should be created after this. Okay, now we need to return the user response over here. Okay, so if you see, after registration, we need to return the response in the format of user response. So I'm going to come over to service again, and what we are going to do is, so this save over here, the save method, this is returning the saved user object, right? So I'm going to get the saved user object. I'm going to say user saved user over here, something like this, and I'm going to say user response over here. Okay, sorry, not user repository, user response. I'm going to say user response is equal to new user response. Okay, and then I'm going to say user response. So user response dot set, and I'm going to set everything now. Okay, so I'm going to wait a minute. So let me copy this part. So set the ID first. Okay, and then I'm going to say set the, okay, one second. So I should copy this much. Okay, because this is a bit of repeated lines that I'm going to write in. Okay, so set password, then I'm going to say user response dot set email, then I'm going to say user response dot set first name, and then I'm going to say user response dot last name. We're going to have created at and then updated at. Okay, updated at. I believe we have used all the fields, right? We have got all the fields. Okay, so this is not needed. And then from here, I'm going to say return, oops, user response, something like this. So this should work absolutely fine. But now we need to set everything, okay, over here. So what do? We need to say saved user dot get ID, right? We need to say saved user dot get password, saved user dot get email. I'll say saved user dot get first name. I'm loving the auto suggestions over here. Dot get last name, saved user dot get created at, and then saved user dot get updated at. Okay, so this is done. A little bit of typing over here, but this is now done. Okay, so we have this controller, this register set now. Okay, we can add validations if you need. So you can come over here, user service, and here what we can do is we can say if, we can check. So we can say if user repository, sorry, not user repository, it is repository dot exists by email. Okay, so this method does not exist, but we'll have to create this method, and I'll say request dot get email. So what we are doing is we are checking if this user exists by email, and if it does exist, I'm going to throw new runtime exception, something like this, and I'm going to say email already exist. So this is a kind of validation that I'm adding. Okay, and you can simply like define this method. So you can hover on this, and I'll say create a method like this, and it will create this method. And here JPA is smart enough to translate this into query. So we are saying exist by email, right? So it is going to return Boolean. Okay, all that is taken care by JPA. So this is done. We have added a small bit of validation as well. Okay, so this register is done. Now we need to get the user profile. So I'll say create this particular method which enables us to get user profile. Okay, now what are we going to do over here? We are accepting the user ID, right? So here I'm first going to add some validation. So I'm going to say user. It's not a validation. We'll first get user. Okay, so we need to get the user profile by this ID, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say repository dot get by ID, or find by ID it should be. Okay, find by ID, something like this, and I'm going to pass in user ID over here, and I'm going to say or else throw over here. Okay, and then I'm going to say something like this, and I'm going to say new runtime exception, and here I'm going to pass in a message like user not found, something like this. Okay, so this is taken care of. We have this user object now. Now what am I going to do? I'm going to create a user response again, right? So user response is something that I'll have to create, and I have user over here, right? And we need to create a user response in a similar way. So what I will do is I'll copy this, okay, and here I'll paste this user response, right? And instead of saved user, this should be user now, right? So So what is happening now is we are constructing the user response and we need to return this user response. So I'm going to say return user response, something like this. Okay. So this is done now, and come over to controller. This is absolutely okay. Now what we can do is let us try running this application. So I'll rerun this application. Let us take a look at the logs. Okay, cannot find symbol, get email, get password, get first name, get last name. This is absolutely okay. So what is happening, if you observe at this error a lot of people get, and I'll show you how you can fix this. So if you see these errors, these are all getters and setters. Okay, so it is not able to find these getters and setters, but we are not getting any sort of error over here. These getters and setters exist, but during runtime it is not able to find. Okay, now think of it this way. These getters and setters are being generated by Lombok, right? So there is a problem in the setting. So what I will do is I'll just go to file. I'll go to settings. Now if you're on Mac, you have to go to preferences, right? So go to settings, and like on Mac also you'll see this kind of a window. So here you need to head over to build tools, and I'll select Maven. So not Maven over here. So one second, it has to be under compiler, annotation processing. Okay, annotation processing, right? Over here, annotation processor. Just select this annotation profile for user service and you will see this processor path. So just change this to obtain processor path, obtain processors from project class path, and say apply and say okay. And now rerun the application. So this should run now. Oops, I get this error again. So let me see what the problem is again. Is this updated? Yes, it is. So what's the problem? Okay, so it worked for me. I'll tell you what I did. So I went here. I again checked my settings. Here in settings, I again checked my settings. Everything looked fine. So what I did is I went over here in the menu, and here you have an option to build the project. So I built this project and then I executed it. Like I rerun the project. And that is when this started working fine. Okay, so this is working absolutely fine now. And what we need to do is we need to now call these endpoints, right? Okay, so one mistake we have done over here, one small mistake that I just spotted over here. So this is a get mapping, right? So we are getting the user profile, but register should not be a get mapping. It has to be a post request, right? So I'll change this to post mapping and I'll rerun this, okay? Because we are sending in data over here and we are creating a resource into the database. So I've just re-executed this project. And now let us, okay, I'll keep this open. I'll come over, I'll copy this API/users. I'll come over here to Postman. I'll create a new blank collection. I'll call this as Fitness Microservices. Okay, something like this. And I'll add a request over here. Okay. Now over here, I'll just paste this API/ or let me like localhost. Let me say localhost, and here I'll say API/users, and I'll pass in register. Okay, register, something like this. So I need to register a user here, and I'll change this to post request, and I'll call this as register, something like this. Now, what is the input that is accepted or expected over here? Okay, so your register request needs email, password, first name and last name. So let me come over here. So now come over here in body and just select raw JSON over here. Okay, and what we are going to do is we are going to craft a JSON over here. So I'm going to select email over here, and here in the body I'll add 2 empty curly braces and I'll say email, and we'll have to add the value of email. So it will be abc@gmail.com, something like this. And this will be also in a pair of double quotes. Okay, then what we have password over here. Password can be abc@123. Okay, and then we have first name. So this key name should be exactly as that of the field name, first name. Okay, so that is how it should be. Otherwise it won't work perfectly. And the first name is John, and then I can have last name over here, and this can be Doe over here. This is done. Okay, now if I send this, let me send this, and you can see 200 okay is the response. You can see this is the ID. Okay, this is the email that we sent. This is the password. This is the first name, last name, created at. So you can see this is the created at timestamp and the updated at timestamp. And this is something that is auto-generated. We did not create or touch it, right? So this is done. Now, if you head over to the database, so if you come over here, okay, here in the database, if you say right click and say all rows, you should see the user being created over here. You can see the user, right? Role is also coming in over here, which is user. Role is something that is not a part of the response, all right? But it is being populated into a database. You can see. So yeah, this API is working absolutely fine. What we can do is I will come over here. Okay, I'll first of all save this and I'll come over here. I'll just duplicate this request. So I'll say duplicate. Okay, instead of register, I'll change this to get request and this will be get profile. Okay, so this is the another API that we should test. And here API/users, and here we need to pass in the ID. Right, so what I'll do is I'll get the ID from here, the user ID, and I'll pass it over here, something like this. Okay, now we don't need body over here, so I'll say none. Okay, and I'll say send. So you can see you're able to get the user as well. So this endpoint is also working absolutely fine, right? So these two endpoints are working fine. You can click on the run button over here and you can see like there are no issues as such. So if you query this, okay, let me query this. You should not see any sort of issues over here. Okay, so I've cleared the stack trace, but you should not see any sort of issues, right? So this is working absolutely fine, and these validations will also work fine. So if you go to register and if you don't send any email, so if I just get rid of this email over here, okay, or if I just delete this email, okay, let me delete the email. Oops, what's happening? Okay, this is the response. I'm sorry. What am I doing? So email, I have to delete the email over here. I deleted email. If I say send, you can see bad request. This is a bad request. You know, why is it a bad request? So if you come over here, you can see, so whenever you get a bad request in the Postman, you can come over here and you can see into a stack trace. You'll see field error in object, register request on field email, rejected value null, right? And you can see this is being triggered. Email is required. This is a message that we have, right? So this won't work. So you need to have email. Now password should not be blank. So if I cut this and if I send this, you'll again see bad request, and you can see default message password is required, right? So first we had email issue, right? And you can see password must have 6 characters. 2 validations failed. Password must have 6 characters and password is required, right? So these two. Earlier we had this email issue. So these validations are also working absolutely okay. All right. And if you like try to recreate this user. So I have this request now. This user is already created with this email. If you send this again, you will get internal server error. Why are you getting internal server error? And this time it's not 400. This time it's 500. If you come over here, if you scroll down, you will have an exception. You can see this is an exception. Email already exists and it's a runtime exception. Why are you getting this? Because here you have a check. Here you have a check. Which says if the user already exists, then you throw in runtime exception that email already exists, right? So that is what we are doing, and there is an internal server error because of that. All right. So this service is working absolutely fine, and I hope you are able to follow along as to what is happening, why is it happening, and what all things we did to make this work, right? So I hope this has been useful and insightful. So now it's time that we begin creating our next microservice, which is the activity service. And for this, we are on our favorite website, Spring Initializer. Keep in mind, if you have a paid version of IntelliJ Ultimate, you can make use of IDE itself to create Spring projects. But for those who don't have, I'm going to make use of Spring Initializer, which is absolutely free to set up Spring Boot applications. So here we'll select the configuration like Maven, Java, latest Spring Boot version. I already have this selected, and these are all the settings from user service. So here I'm going to call this as activity service, something like this over here. Okay, and then here I'll have jar version selected like this, jar and Java version. Sorry, not jar version, but this is Java version. Okay, I'll need Spring Web, I'll need Lombok. Instead of PostgreSQL driver, I'm going to get rid of PostgreSQL driver. Now the beauty of microservice is you can use any kind of database depending on your architecture, right? So if you want a particular service or a particular module to use a specific database, you can switch over to that. So I'm going to make use of Mongo over here, okay, Spring Data MongoDB, okay, and this is what I'm going to use because activity service is going to store its data in MongoDB. So I'll add this over here, okay, and we have got rid of PostgreSQL. I'll get rid of validation also. I don't think I need anything else, okay. I don't even need data JPA, so I'll get rid of that as well, okay. And I'll say explore. You can explore the project structure as to what it's giving you, and once you're done exploring, you can say generate, or you can even directly say generate. So I'll generate this, and the moment you say generate, like always, it is going to give you a zip file. Store it in the same folder where you have your other microservices for this project. So I've downloaded this particular zip file over here in this folder where I have user service as well. I'm going to quickly unzip it over here, extract here. I'll get this folder and I'll get rid of this zip file over here, right? Now coming back to our IDE. So here in IntelliJ, I'm going to close all the tabs. I'm going to head over to project structure. I'm going to minimize this. And here you will see this new folder appear, activity service. If for some reason you are not seeing this because you've just pasted this into your application, or sorry, not application, browser, you can say right click and there should be an option to reload from disk. You can see this reload from disk. So it should reload everything from the disk, okay? But I'm seeing it over here, and this activity service is a Maven project. But now if you come over here and if you go to Java, you will notice like these Java annotations and all this Java code is not being identified yet. This syntax highlighting is not coming. Why? Because IntelliJ is not accepting it as a Maven project. So you can head over here, go to new, you can say module from existing sources, and you can select user service. Sorry, not user service, activity service from here, and you can select pom.xml. You can do that. Or you can either add it from here as well, the Maven icon. But if you're not seeing this Maven icon, then you can add it from here. The moment you do this, you can see reading Maven project and it will get all the dependencies. And you can now see all the syntax highlighting being enabled. And you will also see it being added to this Maven over here. So earlier it was not there here as well. But if you want to add it over here, you can like just say add Maven projects. And you can switch over to activity service pom.xml. And it will get added. And it will recognize it as a Maven project. So keep this in mind. Okay, these are few things that Java developers or Spring Boot developers should always know. Okay, so this is now there, and we have this activity service. Now we are going to need a few, I would say a few things in order to begin working with. So first thing we are going to need is the model. Okay, so since this is an activity service, it is going to store the activity related information. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here in the package. I'm going to say new Java class, and I'm going to say model over here. So I'm going to create a new class under this model package, and I'm going to call this class as activity over here, something like this. So this class is created. Okay, and now what I will do is I'll have a private string ID. So what all this activity class has? It has ID, it has user ID, so it has user ID, something like this. It has a private activity type. So activity type does not exist, but we will be defining it shortly over here. Okay, but it has type now over here, and then it has private. So it has private integer, and it has duration. So we'll store duration as well for the activity. We need things like calories burnt, right? So I'll say integer calories burnt. Okay, I think we should also store local date time, and we should also store start time, because normally when did this activity start and when did this end is what you normally store, right? I'm also going to have things like additional metrics. Okay, so I'll say private map. I'll create a map over here. So this is anything additional if user wants to store and I'll call this additional metrics, something like this. Okay, so this allows flexible storage. So if you're importing activity data from any sort of source or any other data source, you can definitely make use of map over here, right? And I'll say local date time, something like this, and I'll say created at. Okay, this is done, and I'll also need a private local date time, and I'll say updated at, something like this. Okay, now this is done. There are quite a few fields here. Okay, so I'll first create activity type over here. So I'll say more actions. I'll say create a class activity type in the same package. Okay, now what does activity type have? So activity type is basically a enum, which defines the type of activity that our application allows over here right now. So what are the types I need? Running. I'll say I need walking, cycling. I'll say swimming, and weight training. Oops. So weight training, and then I have yoga, and okay, I'll add this, and then I'll say cardio. So add everything that you want your application to store, like I'm doing, stretching, and you can have other. Okay, so these are all the activity types that we have. Now let us add a few annotations over here. So at the top, first of all, I should mark this particular. Oops. So I should mark this with document. So this is coming in from the MongoDB dependency that we have added. Okay, and I'm going to say collection. So this is the collection name that I'm saying over here, activities. Okay, this is something that we are doing. I'm going to make use of data over here. I'm going to make use of builder that is coming in from Lombok. We need a all args constructor. Okay, and we also need a no args constructor. Okay, so all of these you can add. You'll have ID over here. Okay, and we will scroll down over here, and here this additional metrics, I'll have a custom name to this. So I'll say this can be metrics over here. Okay, and here we'll add more couple of annotations. Okay, so I'll say this is created date. Okay, and this is updated date, last modified date. Oops, last modified date. Okay, so this is something that I've added over here. Now here you might be thinking why we are not making use of the annotations like creation timestamp or update timestamp. Now created timestamp is coming in from, you can see over here, it is coming in from Spring data. Okay, you can see org.springframework data.annotation. And if you go over here and if you download the sources, you will see declares a field as the one representing the date entity containing the field that was recently modified. Okay, so it does not say much, but here what it will do is it will auto populate the updated at thing over here. So whenever the document is last updated, this will be auto populated, and for this it will populate the created date, so you don't have to worry about. But creation timestamp and update timestamp, they are Hibernate specific implementations, and they are used in JPA based relational applications. So this here we are not making use of relational database, we are making use of MongoDB, right? And that is why we are making use of these annotations over here. So now since this is done, what we need to do is we now need to get this collection created, or we need to make a database connection. And for making the database connection, you need MongoDB, right? Now there are multiple ways in which you can make use of MongoDB. So you come over here to browser, you can search for MongoDB download, and you will see this link, download MongoDB community server. Okay, if you open this link, you're going to be taken to this particular page wherein you will have the option of downloading the community version of this database. Okay, a community version meaning free version, and you can come over here, and here you have these different options. Okay, so if you are making use of Mac, you have this brew package manager. You can make use of brew install Mongo Atlas like this. Okay, oh, so this is for Atlas, and if you come over here, you have an option to download as well. So this Atlas setup is different. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Okay, but if you come over here, you have an option to download this. So follow this option and not this command option. So come over here and select the version that you want. So select the current version which you marked as current. Windows, if you're on Mac, you can select Mac over here, or if you're on some other operating system like Linux or Ubuntu based, you can select those. Or if you're on Windows, you can select Windows x64. The kind of packaging you want and download. The moment you download, you have to follow simple installation steps and you will have that done. Okay, so this is how you get Mongo installed locally onto your system. You can either do this, or if you don't want to make use of the local version of Mongo, what you can do is you can switch over to Mongo Atlas. Now, what is Mongo Atlas? So Mongo Atlas allows you to run MongoDB in cloud. Okay, so if you go to this Atlas database like this, you'll see this is the Atlas database. This is MongoDB in the cloud. You get this kind of dashboard and the database setup in the browser. Okay, so you can make use of this as well. It's free. They have a limited free version, and if you're short of space and all, you can see this free version. Okay, it's for learning and exploring MongoDB in cloud environment. You get this much of RAM and everything is free, and it's shared. Okay, so you can make use of this if you want to. Okay, but I'm just going to simply install Mongo onto my local machine. You can explore this. You can like try this for free. You can create an account. You get a connection URL which you can add into our in your configuration. Okay, so we'll be adding localhost if you're installing this local version, and if you're not, you'll be making use of this URL string which is given to you by the cloud provider. Okay, so I'll just get this installed. I'll just download this. Now the installation of MongoDB should be very straightforward. It's just like any other software. So after you have downloaded this, just install it. Okay, now along with this, you're going to need a graphical user interface, and during the installation of MongoDB, you will be shown a window, or in a window, you will be shown a checkbox whether you want to download the Compass as well, or whether you want to install the Compass as well. So MongoDB Compass, so if you go under products and if you go to Compass, so it's a graphical user interface that enables you to see what's there in your database. Okay, so you can make use of it for querying, optimizing, analyzing MongoDB data. So since we are working with database, you will need this kind of an interface to work with, right? Or you can simply make use of command line as well if you're comfortable with MongoDB commands. Okay, but if you're not comfortable, I would highly recommend Compass because it's a good interface. So there is no mention of Mongo shell over here, but it will be there in the documentation. Okay, I'm not heading over to the documentation. You can explore that, but you can search for Mongosh, and Mongosh is the shell if you don't want to install the Compass. Okay, but I would recommend installing Compass, and you don't need to install it separately. Whenever you install MongoDB, you would be shown an option whether you want to add Compass as well to the installation. Okay, so if you miss that window, then there's no need to worry. You can download it separately from here and install as well. Now I already have Compass installed here. Okay, and you can see I'm a user of MongoDB. I have done a lot of connections over here. Now if I say connect over here, this is my local MongoDB instance. It is saying connection refused. Why is it saying so? Because MongoDB is installed as a service on my system. So if you head over to services, just search for services like this over here, services. Okay, in your machine, and here you will see the service for MongoDB as well. So here in M, you should see MongoDB server. Okay, and you can see it's not running. Okay, it's manual. So I'll say start over here. Okay, and MongoDB service is started now, and let us see if we are able to connect now. So you should be able to connect now, right? So it's there, and we are now able to connect to it. Okay, now what you can do is you can see this is the test collection or test compass over here. Okay, these are all the databases that exist. Okay, so what we are going to do is we are going to create a new database over here. I'm going to call this database as activity, and I can say fitness, something like this, or fitness activity, something like this. Okay, fitness activity. All right, you can call whatever you want to, and I'm going to you can also give a collection name. So the collection name is, if you come over here, it's activities. Okay, so sorry, it's activities over here. So we are going to take this and we are going to add it over here. Okay. But one second, there's a spelling mistake. I've added collation over here. So this should be collection and not collation. Okay. So keep that in mind. Otherwise you will get errors later on. Okay. I accidentally made a typo. You'll create a database over here. You can see fitness activity. Okay. This is a database. You can copy the connection string. Okay. The connection string is copied and come over here. Head over to resources and application.properties and you can paste the connection of string over here. So this is the connection string to which we will be connecting. Now you can make use of application.properties or YAML. I'll make use of YAML for a while over here. Okay, YAML like so. It's refactored, right? Now what we are going to do is we are going to define everything over here. Okay, so we are going to say Spring. Okay, and we'll convert this to the YAML format, application colon name, and then again colon activity service, something like this. Okay, so this is done, and then I'm going to have data, and I'm going to say MongoDB, and I'm going to say over here, I'm going to add the URI. Okay, so I'm going to say there are a couple of properties. One is URI. Other is database that we need to add. Okay, something like this. Okay, and I'll say what is the URI. So URI is this over here. Okay, so I'll cut this and I'll paste it over here. And what is the name of the so what is the name of the database? So this is the database name, right? So I'm going to say fitness activity, something like this. So I'm going to say fitness slash activity, fitness activity, something like this. And then I'll copy this. I'll say database is also fitness activity. Okay, so this is done and I don't think we need anything else. Also what I observed is here we need to add server port as well. So I'm going to say server and port, and this should be running at 8082, right? Because by default it will run at 8080 and we already have user service, right? So for user service, I'll say this can be, so if you go to user service, this can be at, let me go to the top and I can say server colon port colon 8081, something like this. Okay, so this is being taken care of. Okay, this is 8081, this is 8082. All right, and now what we can do is we can try running this application. So I'll add over here, I'll come over here, I'll say run activity service. Let us see if we are able to successfully run it. Okay, application is running now. Okay, you can see some logs from Mongo, and if you come over here, okay, you won't see any sort of data over here, of course, because you know there is literally nothing. But when we add the data, or when we add the APIs wherein the data is being populated, you should see everything coming, right? But you can see some sort of logs over here. If you go to logs, you are going to see started over here, the application was started. Okay, repository scanning was being done, and you can see over here some sort of logs from Mongo client over here. You can see so all these logs indicate that the connection has been successful and established. Okay, so this is working absolutely okay, right? So this is done, and we have the database set up done over here for our activity service. So I hope this has been useful, and I hope you have been able to follow along. So now let's begin working on the endpoint for this activity service. So what I'm going to do is we are going to add a controller and service along with the repository that will help us work with this particular service. So I'm going to begin by adding a controller. So I'm going to right click on the main package. This is the main package, com.fitness.activity-service. I'm going to say create a new class, and I'm going to say controller dot, I'm going to say activity controller, something like this. Okay, so this is created. Now within this controller, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have all the mappings. Okay, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to mark this as a REST controller. I'm going to also have a request mapping annotation which will map this entire controller to a particular endpoint. So if any of these endpoints is called, it will be routed to this controller. Okay, so any endpoint coming in with hostname / API / activities, it will be routed to this controller. Okay, so that is what we are telling Spring Boot. Now here within this, I'm going to add a few endpoints definition. So first is post mapping over here. First one is going to be post mapping, and of course this is going to allow us to create the activity. So I'm going to say response entity, and this is going to return activity response. Now activity response does not exist yet, but this is a DTO class that is going to return the response, and this class is going to define the response that this activity is going to return. Okay, so I'm going to say track activity. Okay, we are seeing red marks. We'll see a few red marks. That's absolutely okay, so don't worry about that. All right, but the goal is basically to set up the structure of the controller over here, or the API is what you can say. Okay, so this is one mapping which will allow us to basically track the activity. Now here we'll have some code added, okay, which I'll be adding in a bit. Okay, and over here what I'm going to do is I'm going to accept activity request over here. So we have activity response, which defines the response that this particular endpoint is going to give, and this defines the request that this endpoint is going to receive. So I'm going to call it request over here. Okay, and this is going to come in request body. So I'm going to say request body over here, something like this. Okay, now here what I'm going to do is I'm going to say return response entity dot OK. And I'm going to add a semicolon. Now in OK, I'm going to call activity service over here. So we are going to actually call service over here, and I'm going to say activity over here, and I'm going to pass in request. Now service does not exist, and neither these two classes. So what we will do is we'll start defining these two. Okay, so I'll say, so here it says it is giving you a suggestion, create class activity response. So what I will do is I'll just click on that suggestion, and you get this kind of a pop-up. And instead of controller, I'll get this created in a DTO. You can create a package called DTO, and I'll say OK. All right, so you can see this package is automatically created over here. You can see over here DTO. All right, and what we are going to do is we are going to have all the definition of the response. Now the response will be much likely similar to what we have in the database. So I'll just copy this and I'll just paste everything over here. Okay, I'll just remove these annotations, okay, that we have added in the entity. So basically we have ID, user ID, type, duration, calories burned, everything. Okay, created at, updated at. Okay, I don't think we need anything else, and I'll make use of a data annotation from Lombok, and I'll get rid of these import statements that came here when we copied the fields. Okay, so this activity response is done. All right, and we're done with this. Now what we need is we also need one more DTO. If you come over here, so it has to be activity request. So I'll come over here, I'll say create class activity request, and instead of this I'll select DTO and I'll say OK. Now this class is also created, and here I'll start defining the fields. So I'll say, what do you need in request? So first thing is I need user ID over here. Okay, you can accept the user ID, or you can accept the user ID in the request header as well. Okay, so you have this user ID, you have private, and you would say activity type. Okay, so you need activity type as well. Now what is activity type? Activity type is basically an enum that you have already defined. Okay, so this is just a reminder for you. We have activity type, so we need user ID against which user this activity is being recorded. We also need the type of activity that is being recorded. We need integer duration is what I would record. I would also record calories burned. So I'll say integer calories burned. Okay. I would also record start time. So I'll say local date time, and I'll say start time. This is denoting the activity start time over here. And I'll have additional metrics. So additional metrics can be something like this. Okay, so it's basically these all fields is what we have added, except created at and updated at from the user, because those are auto generated, right? So this is taken care of, and I'll say data over here. Okay, So data, if you're not aware of, if you go inside, you will see over here, it is equivalent to getter, setter. It will generate require args constructor, toString and equals hash node method for this particular class over here. Okay, so this is taken care of. We have activity request and activity response defined. Now we need activity service. So what I will do is I'll say private activity service over here, and I'll say activity service. Okay, and this does not exist yet. So I'll say more actions. I'll say create a class, and instead of controller, I'll say service over here. Okay, so I have this service defined now. Okay, now this service will have this particular method. Okay, track activity. So I'll get this method created here. Okay, and will immediately map this with the service annotation so that it becomes a Spring managed component. And over here, I'll say required, or I'll say all args constructor over here. Why? So you can either add an auto-wired annotation over here, either add auto-wired annotation, or you add a all args constructors for Spring to automatically inject this dependency. Otherwise, you're going to get null pointer exception when you try to make use of activity service. Okay, so just make sure you do that. So we have added this, and now over here, what we are going to do is when the user says track activity, we are going to actually save this into the database. Okay, and whenever we are working with the database, what do we need? We need a repository as well, right? So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to create a new Java class. This is actually going to be an interface, and I'm going to call this as activity repository, something like this. Okay, and I'm going to mark this as repository, and this is going to extend Mongo repository. So this is a interface that we already have. So if you hover on this, you can see this is an interface that already exists, and since we are making use of MongoDB, we are adding this over here. Okay, so I'm going to say activity over here because that is a model that it is representing, and I'll add string over here. Okay, now this is taken care of. We have this repository, and we are going to need this repository to save data into the database. So I'm going to say private activity repository, and I'm going to say repository, or you can just say activity repository over here. Okay, so yeah, this is done, and now we have the repository. And in order to get this automatically injected, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say required args constructor. Okay, so this is an annotation that I'm adding. You can see this generates a constructor with the required arguments. Okay, and required arguments are final fields or fields with constraints such as non-null. Okay, so you can call this, you can mark this as final. Okay, now the difference in required args constructor and all args constructor over here is there. Okay, so if you hover on this, it says all args constructor will generate an all args constructor, okay, for every field in the class. So if you have 10 fields over here, it will generate a constructor for all the fields, but required args constructor will generate it only for final, you can see final, and fields with constraints such as non-null. Okay, so that is what it's going to generate the constructor for. Okay, so I'm making use of two different things over here, just that so that you know as to how you can make use of it. Okay, now over here in the activity request, so we have this track activity, we are getting the data over here. Now what I'm going to do is I am going to come over here, okay, and I'm going to create an activity. So I'm going to say activity over here, okay, because we need to save it into the database, right? So I'm going to say activity and activity dot builder. Okay, so I'm going to make use of builder over here, and I'm going to say dot, so user ID. So first we need to set the user ID. So what is the user ID? I'll say request dot get user ID, right? Then I'll say type over here. Type is the another parameter that we are sending in with the request. So you can say request dot get type over here. Loving the auto suggestions. Okay, duration, and you can say request dot get duration. Okay, then you have start time, calories burned. Okay, so I'll say calories burned first, request dot get calories burned, and then let me scroll up. Okay, so you're going to say start time, and I'm going to say request dot get start time. That is done. You have additional metrics, so I'm going to say request dot get additional metrics, something like this, and then we're going to build this object, something like this. Okay, so this is done, and then what I'm going to do is activity, and I'm going to say saved activity over here, and I'm going to call in the repository. I'm going to say activity repository dot save, and I'm going to pass in the activity over here, the activity object that we have built so far. Okay, so this is done, and then we need to return. Now what do we need to return? We have this saved activity, which is the object of type activity, and we need to return the response in the format activity response. Okay, now these two are two different objects, right? So what I will do is I will create another method over here. Okay, I'll say private activity response over here. This is returning activity response, and I'm going to say map to response over here, and I'm going to accept activity over here. Okay, so I'm doing this. Okay, now what is the job of this method? So as you can see over here, or as you can guess, this method will take the object of type activity and it will convert it into the object of type activity response, because here we need that conversion. Okay, so instead of doing that conversion and hard coding things over here, I've just created a separate method for this purpose, because this then we can use across different methods, right? So from the reusability standpoint, I've created this, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to like start creating activity response over here. I'm going to say response is equal to new activity response, and I'm going to set all the fields. So I'm going to say set ID. So what is the ID? It is activity dot get ID. Then I'm going to say response dot set user ID. Okay, so you need to make sure you have the user ID, and you can say activity dot get user ID. You can say response dot set type over here. Now what is the type? Activity dot get type, something like this. Then you have response dot set duration, and you can say activity dot get duration, something like this. You'll say response dot get calories, set calories burned over here, and you can say activities dot get calories burned. Response dot you can say set start time over here, and you have response dot get start time. Okay, so this is done over here, and start time I have additional metrics as well. Okay, so set additional metrics. So I'll say response dot get additional metrics. Okay, and then you have created time. So set created at, and I'll say activity dot get created at, something like this. Response dot set updated at, and you'll say activity dot get updated at. So this is done. Okay, we have the object constructed over here, and I'll return this response. None of the fields are left now. What I will do over here is I'll call this map to response, and I'll just pass in activity object. So this is going to convert this into the type activity response, and it is going to return it to me. Okay, so this is being taken care of. All right, now what I will do is let us try running this application. Let us run this application. Okay, so we are getting this error again, which is saying like it's not able to generate the getters and setters, and it's likely the settings have been messed up. So go to annotation processing if you find this issue, and change this processor path for activity service to that of obtain processor from project class path, and just apply and say okay, and just to run again, and this should work now absolutely fine. Oops, so what happened again? Let me rebuild the project again. So I'll come over here, build the project. Okay, let me see the settings again. Okay, the settings are fine, it should work. So let me try again. Okay, so get user ID. These are all Lombok related issues, but luckily this is only coming in the activity service and not in the rest of the project. So let me try rebuilding the project again. So I'm rebuilding the project. Let me see if it works. So project is rebuilt, and let us run this. It should work now. Yeah. So rebuilding. So after changing the setting, make sure you rebuild the project. Okay, because there was no issue as such, but I don't know, it was just creating a nuisance. Okay, so here you can see now we have this endpoint API/activity. So I'll come over here to my collection, and here you have fitness microservices. So within this, I'll add a folder. Oops, not a collection. So go over here, and I'll say add a folder, and this folder is for user. Okay, so earlier we had the request for user, so I'll move these requests under user. Okay, now we have one more microservice, so I'll organize this. I'll say activity, something like this, and I'll add a request to work with. Okay, now over here I'll say API slash, so it has to be activities. Okay, activities, it has to be a post request over here, and within body I'll select raw JSON, and here I need to pass in the data. Okay, and what all data is needed? So here we are accepting the object that we need is in this format. Okay, so this is activity request. So if you go over here, activity request, you need user ID, type, duration, calories burnt, start time, and additional metrics. So I'm just going to create this kind of a request. So I'll come over here, okay, and I'll start creating the JSON. So you can follow this format. I'm going to say user ID over here. Now what is the user ID? I can say user ID is 1 for now. Okay, then you can have type over here. Okay, and type is running. So let me add running over here. Okay, now this type should match the type that you have defined in activity type over here. So activity type. So this is running. Okay, so that is something that I've added over here. Now here I'm going to say duration. So this duration I'll have 30. Okay, then I have calories burned. Okay, now this calories burned will be 300. So remember, activity request. So this calories burned, you can see B is capital. It's camel case convention. So the same should match over here. Okay, if you just make a spelling mistake, this field won't be mapped to calories burned. So that is something that you need to keep in mind when you are sending in the request and designing the JSON. Okay, now over here I'm going to say 2024 12 12, and I'm going to add this in this format. Okay, so this is a format in which it will accept the data. Okay, or you can keep this 2025. Okay, and 01 for example. It's totally up to you as to what is the start time that you want to have. I'm just adding a dummy data. I'll say additional metrics over here. Okay, and for additional metrics we will add a nested object over here, and I'll say distance over here, and I'll say 5.2. okay, so these are all additional metrics that I'm adding. Okay, I'll say average speed. Okay, and I can say 10.4. okay, and I'll just come over here and I'll say max heart rate, something like this, and I'll say 165. Now why are we having additional metrics first of all? So I'll tell you something. Whenever you are building this kind of a fitness tracker wherein you are tracking fitness activities, now this data will be coming in from a source or from a device, right? So for example, your company might have a mobile application, right? And the mobile application is consuming this API. Now that mobile application might be fetching the data from Google Fit or from Apple Health or from any application like Fitbit or any other application, right? So it is fetching the data and it is sending it to the backend API. It is recording it into our application. And every application like Google Fit or whether it's any third-party application that will have any sort of metrics that they are tracking. Okay, the metrics would differ from service to service. So for example, one service might send distance and other service might not send distance. So it's best to have a field wherein a user can add anything, and additional metrics is something like that, wherein if there is any sort of additional metric that the service is sending, then we are not saying that, hey, I'm not accepting these additional metrics. Instead, what we are doing is we have a provision wherein the front end can, or the request in the backend can be accepted in this format, and any sort of metrics can be provided over here. Okay, then there can be a data science team or something like that who takes a look at the data that has been accumulated, and it can do the reporting and it can analyze it. So all that can be done. Okay, so now the request is ready. I'll save this request and I'm calling this register activity. Okay, so I hope you're understanding as to why we have this additional metrics field, because these APIs will be consumed anywhere. Like you might have a mobile app on Android, mobile app on iOS, or a front-end application that user can use it on web, or you might also have a Chrome extension. Okay, APIs can be consumed from anywhere. So if, for example, you have a mobile app and there is an integration with Fitbit. Now Fitbit is sending, let's say, 20 metrics, and those 20 metrics are not there in this main JSON over here. So what you can do is you can tell whoever using the API, you can say that, hey, this is the format. I need duration, calories burned, type, and start time over here, because this is something that everyone will send. This is a standard, right? What is the type of activity? That's the standard. Duration, everybody will send. Calories burned, everybody will send. Start time, everybody will send. Okay, but there can be some additional metrics that will be sent from service to service depending on which service is there. So you can have this additional metrics tag under which you can send any sort of metrics that the service is trying to send. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I am going to send this, shoot this request. Let us see if we get any sort of errors. Okay, what happened? API, so are we calling the right endpoint? I'm calling 8080. Okay, 1 second. So I believe it's not running on 8080. It's running on 8081 or 8082, right? It's running on 8082. I'm sorry about that. So I'll change this and I'll say send this. Now you can see this is the response that we got. Okay, and we are getting created at and updated at as null. Okay, so we will be evaluating this. Start time is also being recorded as null. Okay, why so? And you can see additional metrics is also coming in as null. Okay, that's absolutely fine. We'll take a look at what is happening. But if you come over here in fitness activity, you should see some sort of data accumulated here. Okay, so it's recorded in the database. You can see this data is recorded in the database, but somehow in the response, it's coming in as null. I thought it's not being recorded in the database and there is some issue, but you can see it's being recorded in the database. Calories burned, start time. You can see the metrics object over here, the additional metrics, and you can see everything is coming absolutely fine and it's being saved over here. Okay, now that's the benefit of MongoDB because it does not have a structure, So when you are storing user information, you have a structure because you know what kind of user information you want to store. So that is why you made use of PostgreSQL or any sort of relational database like MySQL you can use. Okay, but when it comes to activities, like I said, different services might send activities in different format. For example, if you have a watch, if your company launches a hardware watch, wristwatch, a smartwatch, okay, it might send data in a different format than what is being sent in the app, right? So you want to record everything. You don't want to miss the data, right? Because you might have a data science team who might want to analyze the data down the line. So rejecting data is not good. Just save it and then you decide what you want to do with the data, right? So in that case, MongoDB is really helpful because it does not have literally any sort of schema, as you can see, right? There is no schema over here, right? So you can see these all fields have been recorded over here. Okay, and now what we can do is we can see as to why this is coming in as null. So I was checking the code and I realized one small mistake that I did over here is we are returning saved activity. We are supposed to return saved activity, right? But we are here, whatever activity we have created, that is what we are mapping to response. So this is incorrect. We actually need to pass in saved activity over here, okay, which we did not do. So I'll just stop and rerun the application and let us check what happens now. Okay, so it's running now, and let me try sending this request again. Okay, so now also we are getting the same issue over here. So I'm not seeing start time. I'm not seeing this. Okay, let me refresh over here. Okay, so I'll hit this icon. You can see there is second object also created, but here we are getting null. So here I realized when we are mapping to response, okay, what I did, one mistake I did is I should be taking the data from activity and setting it to response. But here what I've done is, in some places by mistake, I have set the data from response to that of response. So response is already null. So of course it is going to give you null only. Okay, so I've done this. Now let me restart this. So this should now at least give start time and additional metrics. Let me see. Okay, if I send this again, if you see, okay, so it's giving additional metrics, it's giving start time, but it's still not giving created at and updated at. So what we would do is we would need to enable Mongo auditing over here for this to work. So I'll come over here, and here we have this activity class. Okay, so I will come over here. I'll add a new class here. Okay, and I'll create a config package over here, config, and I'll say Mongo config. Okay, so in this particular config file, I'll just say this is a configuration and I need to enable Mongo editing. Sorry, not editing, auditing. Okay, so this is Mongo auditing because this is a part of auditing over here. Okay, so I'll just do this and let us rerun this application. And now I'll come over here and I'll try sending this. So now you can see this is working fine, and now we are getting all the things properly. Okay, so some issues, but if you refresh this, you should see everything like created at and updated at also being populated for the latest object over here. Okay, so yeah, this is working fine now, and we have the metrics object as well, you can see. All right, so yeah, this is working absolutely fine, and we have the endpoint up and running. So I hope this has been useful, and I hope you have been able to follow along. And we've just built one endpoint, we'll be building some more. Now let us move over to another endpoint over here. So here in the controller, we have this one endpoint wherein we are allowing the user to track the activity. Now, of course, we should also have the ability to get users activity, right? That also we should be having. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just duplicate this entire mapping, and I'll have a get mapping on the same endpoint over here. Okay, and what this is going to do is it is going to return the activity of a specific user. Okay, and I'll get rid of this. Okay, we don't need this activity request object here, and instead of track activity, I'm going to say get user activity over here, or activities, something like this. Okay, and now here this won't be activity response, but this would be the list of activity response, because one user can have multiple activities, right? And activity response is representing a single activity. So if you go to activity response, it is representing a single activity, right? So one user might have multiple activities against himself, so we need a list. Okay, now this is done, and response entity dot activity service dot track activity. So instead of track activity, we'll have get user activities. So I'll create a method with the same name in activity service, and this would need user ID. So since we are getting user specific activities, we also need to tell the service method as to which user's activity we want. So we are passing in user ID. Now the question is, how do we get user ID here in the controller? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a request header. Okay, so this is the annotation that I'm going to use, and I'm going to say over here x hyphen user hyphen ID over here. Okay, and I'm going to say string user ID, something like this. Okay, so this is the method that will be in work, and what it will do is it will get this particular parameter, this particular header, like header with this name, and it will populate the ID in this variable, and then we are passing in the variable here into activity service. Okay, so this is what we are doing. Okay, now as a next step, we need to create this method. So I'll get this method created over here. Okay, and this is a method that will simply interact with the database, and it will give us the list of the activities for that particular user. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say activity repository, and I can say, okay, so I can say find by, and this has find by ID. Okay, but we don't want find by ID, because if you come over here, this ID is this ID, right, which is the unique identifier in the Mongo database, but I want to filter by user ID, right? So what I will do is I'll come over here and I'll say find by user ID over here, and I'm going to pass in user ID. Now this find by user ID does not exist, right? So of course we need to create this. Okay, and this is going to return the list of activity, something like this, and I'm going to call this as activities over here. Okay, and I'll get this method created in the repository. So you can see find by user ID, which will return the list of activity, and I'm passing in the user ID. Now what Spring or the Hibernate will do is it will automatically generate the query for this in the hindsight. So it will take a look at this method name and it will say, okay, this is find by, which means where clause, by user ID over here. Okay, so it is filtering the data by where and it is adding user ID over here, and it is returning the list of activity over here. Okay, and how is it filtering? Filtering by user ID, and where is the user ID? User ID is coming in as a parameter over here. And what do I have to return? I have to return the list of activity. And why list of activity? Because this repository, okay, is talking to or is representing activity over here. You can see over here, this is the model, right? So we are returning the list of activity. So this entire thing will be done by Hibernate itself in the hindsight. Okay, now we have this. What I'm going to do is I have this list, right? So I can convert this into a stream, and I need to map every object in the list to activity response, right? I have a list of activity. So here we had activity. Okay, so one second. Here we had activity and we converted that activity to activity response over here. Okay, you can see this. We made use of this method, right? So this was a method that was used. So we are going to make use of the same method and we'll convert every item in this list into the type of activity response. So we need to do this mapping. So I'm going to say return. I'm going to say activities dot stream. So I convert this into a stream and I'll say dot map over here, and I'm going to say this, and I'm going to say map to response. So I'm calling map to response for every item in the list. Okay, and then I'm going to say collect. Oops, not close. I'm going to say collect over here. And how am I collecting? I'll be collecting it to the list, something like this. Okay, so I'm going to say collector dot to list, something like this. Okay, so this is taken care of. All right, and yeah, this is done in my opinion. So this should work absolutely fine. And let me rerun the application over here, and I'll come over here. I'll copy this header name, okay, this X user ID over here, okay, and I'll go over here. I'll just duplicate this request. I'll say duplicate, okay, and this will be get user activity, something like this, and I'll say get request, okay, and in the header, so here we have headers. I'll paste this key, okay, oops, so I'll paste the key over here, okay, so this key is been added and I'll pass in 1 over here, okay, so this is going in the header. I'll save this and let me trigger this request. So you can see we now have the response wherein we are getting all the data from the backend, okay, and yes, some initial data set is having null over here, which is absolutely okay, so completely ignore that, and this one is perfect. Okay, so we're getting all the data that we have in the database for that particular user. Now if you add 2 over here, we should get an empty list because this user ID does not exist or there is no recorded data against this particular user. Okay, so this endpoint is working absolutely fine. Now I'll create one more endpoint wherein we should be able to get the activity by ID. So every activity has an ID, okay, and whenever user passes that particular ID, we should be able to filter and get that particular activity. So I'll come over here in the controller. This is pretty straightforward. I'll copy this entire get mapping over here, okay, and I'm going to say over here something like this. I'm going to accept this URL parameter or a path variable, and I'm going to say activity ID over here. Oops, I'm going to accept this activity ID. Okay, so since we are creating an API to get the activity or to fetch a single activity by its ID, we need to pass in activity ID in the URL as the path variable. Okay, and here instead of returning the list, it is going to return the activity response like so. And here I'll say get activity, something like this. This is the method name. Okay, and then I'll come over here and it's in the request header. This says pass this user ID, so this is not needed. Instead, we'll say this should be path variable over here, okay, and this will be activity ID like so, okay, and here I'll pass in activity ID, okay, and activity service dot instead of get user activities, I'll say get activity by ID, something like this. Okay, so this is done. This is how the endpoint will be represented. Now I'll quickly go and create this method over here. Okay, and I'll have this definition for this particular method. Okay, now the definition for this should be very straightforward. So I'll simply say return activity repository. Now what is the activity ID? Activity ID is this ID that is being generated by the database, right? This is the ID. So I'll say activity repository dot find by ID. Find by ID. You can see this is the method that we get, and I'll pass in activity ID over here, and then I'll say dot map over here. Okay, and we can make use of this same thing. Okay, the same thing that we have written earlier, and then I'll say or else throw. Okay, why or else throw? Because this is going to return an optional. You can see it is returning an optional. Map is returning an optional. So I'm going to say or else throw over here. Okay, so or else throw, and then I'll have something like this, and I'll say runtime exception over here. Okay, runtime exception, something like this, and I'm going to say activity not found. Activity not found with ID, and I'll say activity ID, something like this. Okay, like so. And this will be new. I missed the new keyword. Okay, so I'm creating an object of runtime exception and I'm throwing it. Okay, so this is done. Now let me run this and let us see if we are able to get the data. Okay, so this should run absolutely okay. It's running fine. I'll come over here. I'll just duplicate this. Okay, so I'll duplicate this, and here I'll say get activity by ID, something like this, and here activities slash, I need to pass in the activity ID. So what is the activity ID? Let's get this, or let's get this one, the last one. So I've copied this ID. Okay, come over here and paste this over here. Okay, and this is a get request. Save this. So I'll send this, and you can see you get this ID or you get this activity, right? And if you add any character in the end, so this is now an invalid ID. And if you send this, you'll get internal server error. Why are you getting internal server error? Because you're throwing a runtime exception, right? So if you scroll up here, you'll see activity not found with ID this. So you have got the runtime exception. Okay, but if you remove this one in the end, it's a valid ID and it will give you the right response. Okay, so the endpoint is working as expected, and I hope you have been able to follow along, and I hope this has been useful.